A reading from Luke chapter 24, verses 1 through 12. But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they came to the tomb, taking the spices that they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they went in, they did not find the body. While they were perplexed about this, suddenly 2 men in dazzling clothes stood before them. The women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground. But the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified, and on the 3rd day rise again." Then they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told all this to the 11 and to all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them, who told this to the apostles. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb. Stooping and looking in, he saw the linen cloths by themselves. Then he went home, amazed at what had happened. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church.
Thanks be to God.
Someone I'm rather fond of invites a comparison between the Christmas stories and the Easter stories in the New Testament. In doing so, he notices that the Christmas stories are filled with great fanfare. A bright angelic chorus breaks forth from the sky, singing, beckoning the lowly shepherds to go to the cradle. There's a bright star in the sky, and it draws these visitors from the east to come and worship and bring the precious gifts to the babe. And all that fanfare around the story of the birth of Jesus Christ is meant to draw attention to just how special this life is. The resurrection stories, in comparison, are not quite so grandiose. There's the agony of the arrest, the horror of the execution, and a very quick burial. And while everyone is reeling in loss, they go to the tomb, prepared to complete the rituals of burial. They go to the tomb to cry. But when they get there, things aren't quite as they were expecting. The stone has been moved. The lifeless body is gone. When they get to the tomb, the resurrection has already happened. And no one was there when it occurred. Well, each of the resurrection stories that we find in the New Testament seem to happen to a small group of people here and then a small group of people there. Subtle, not grandiose. And the writers of the New Testament don't try to convince us with their spin. They don't try to parade before us irrefutable evidence of what happened. They don't try to tell the story with some intellectual apology or explanation for how the impossible could happen. No, there is no spin, there is no attempt. They simply tell us what they saw. Jesus is alive. The great challenge of Easter is to believe that of all the people who have lived and died, one of them did not stay dead. And because one of us did not stay dead, there is hope for each and every one of us. Easter is the path to a blessed eternity. And the second challenge of Easter is for you and I to put our foot on that path. Now, in resurrection, Jesus does not simply come back to life. He doesn't resume life as it was before. He doesn't come up out of the tomb and walk back up to Nazareth or to Galilee and resume a simple life, caring for his aging parents, marrying and having children. Resurrection is not simply a reversal of death. He's not restored to what he had been. But Jesus emerges from that tomb transformed. Well, the other night we had a Tenebrae service here in our sanctuary. And if you're familiar with that service, it's called a service of shadows. And as you tell the story of Jesus' last days, you extinguish one candle at a time. Well, the person who was supposed to extinguish the Christ candle didn't want to do it. And who of us would want to do that? There's something about us that just doesn't want to believe that Jesus died. We'd like to believe that since Jesus was God and that God couldn't die, that the crucifixion, well, it's only an appearance. It only looks like he died. But we put the candle out even though we don't want to, because we know he died. He dies because we kill him. He dies because we're angry. He dies because we're afraid. He dies because we don't want to be challenged to step beyond a life of selfishness and self-centeredness and into a life of blessed and beloved community. He dies, and in his death, we are confronted by what we did. And in that confrontation, we are redeemed. We are challenged to live life in another way. Well, the resurrection stories kind of present us with some apparent contradictions. But those contradictions are only apparent. They are not actual. And if we sit with the contradictions long enough, they'll jar our minds to see life differently. I remember the first novel I ever read. It was Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. I'm sure one of you's read that. And you remember that opening paragraph? If not, I've written it down. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was a season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. And when Dickens parades these differences before us, or at least when he did it to me, it jarred my mind a little bit. The apparent contradictions invited me to think a little more deeply. In the resurrection, Jesus has a physical body. He's recognized. Although there's a little confusion here and there. Mary thinks he's the gardener. And when Jesus appears to people on the road to Emmaus, they don't recognize him until he does a very familiar action. He breaks bread and gives it to them. He asks one person not to touch him because he is not yet ascended. And then in another place, he invites someone else to place their hands in his wounds. He eats both bread and fish. But in resurrection, the physical body seems to be capable of transcending limits that my physical body cannot. It passes through locked doors where the disciples are gathered filled with great fear. He reads Thomas's mind when Thomas is in the throes of doubt. Jesus understands before Thomas speaks. In resurrection, Jesus leaves the world and at the very same time promises to be with us always. The jarring contradictions of resurrection shake my mind free and bid me to embrace a new perception of reality. It isn't what I think it is. There's so much more. There's so much more. One has said that in the resurrection, Jesus has gone into God's future. And from God's future, Jesus beckons us to move closer. And from God's future, Jesus will come and renew all things. the Easter challenge is to follow Christ as we are led toward God's future. I saw some very encouraging signs in the life of our church. And I'm not sure if I'm preaching now or bragging, but you'll probably forgive me for either. This past year, we've worked together with many of our sister congregations in the city of Concord, creating a sheltering ministry for families. It's called Family Promise. And 10 or 12 churches each agree to take a week and convert the building into a temporary shelter. We had beds in Hannah Hall, and a couple of families came and had a nice, warm, dry, safe place to sleep. Breakfast each morning, dinner each night. A shelter that will not go away when the warm weather comes. If the risen Christ is calling you, and you want to be a part of that work, we could use your help. And you could make a difference. And whenever I think of the ministry of Family Promise, my mind goes back to a woman named Roddy, a longtime member of our congregation. I'm sure some of you recognize her name. While we were planning this ministry, Roddy had been diagnosed with cancer, and she knew that her days were short. But she leaned into God's future even on her deathbed. She had a sum of money that she wanted to give. But the program wasn't ready to receive it. So she invited us to hold on to her precious gift until the time was right. Well, like you, I've been thinking and praying about the very cruel and violent attacks that have dominated our news for the past few weeks. And our prayers do indeed go out to the families in Paris and in Brussels, as they do to so many other places in our world. But it seems to me that in addition to just killing people, the terrorists want to do something else. They want to destabilize societies. They want us to react quickly out of our shock and outrage rather than to react thoughtfully and deliberately and to do our very best to keep everyone safe. I believe if we can allow the risen Christ to quell our fears, if we can trust one another, even in the midst of this chaotic season, we will build a better world if we can stay strong. Well, let me close my Easter sermon with one more illustration. Consider the crocuses. Not all crocuses in general, but the particular crocuses that you'll find out in that circular garden on the way into the sanctuary. We've been in the midst of digging that garden up and hoping to replace it. And last fall, I think it was, we pulled and we tried to get everything out of there. and then we doused it with Roundup. I don't know how much Roundup we put on that circle, trying to kill all those weeds and everything that was there so we could start afresh. We thought we were in pretty good shape until this spring. And those little crocuses just kept coming back. Despite all of our efforts, there's just something so beautiful, it can't be killed. I want you to know this morning that there's something like that in you. There is something so beautiful in you that will come to blossom no matter what has happened to you. That beauty will rise. There is no hurt that the risen Christ cannot touch and bring healing. And there is no mistake so bad that the risen Christ does not fully understand and set you free from the burden of guilt or embarrassment. And there's nothing that anyone else can do to you that can kill that beauty of life within you. But, like the Easter stories themselves, it won't come with great fanfare. You won't find it among the crowds. You will find it the way the women found the risen Christ. If you're willing to go back to the place of brokenness and stay there long enough and look carefully, you will see. Tombstones have moved. God works our conflicts out. Oh, death is real, but it is not final. Jesus is alive, and so are you. And we follow him. It's kind of tricky. It's not easy. There's maybe a glimmer of light here and a flicker of hope there. There's a reassuring impulse and an affirming word from a neighbor. It's subtle. It's subtle because the resurrection itself is subtle. Jesus is alive, and so are you. And our challenge is to believe that. Amen.